Christendom in the 1st and 2nd century. And they flourished throughout the centuries into what became the worst genocide in our history. Anti-Semitism, the hate crime of Jews, has been so involved in our history, both from a government's point of view and from a church point of view. It's been so involved that ordinary men and women killed innocent men, women, and children just because they were Jews. And it's a tragic part of our history that ordinary people enabled and fueled Holocaust. It wasn't just a few Nazis. And as we go through history, we can see that history built a story which enabled bankers, teachers, doctors, nurses, policemen, those in authority, those ordinary working people, to commit the most terrible crimes in history. And we have to learn from that. And that's why memorial, particularly the Holocaust memorial, is really important. And it's really important that our schools and our young children are involved in the learning of Holocaust and remembering Holocaust, because they're the generation who are going to tell the story of this terrible tragedy. We have Holocaust denial today, which is the story of academics even who are denying the Holocaust and saying that it didn't happen. We have to continue to tell the story that it did happen and that it mustn't happen again. If we look back in our history, we see that the persecution of Jews from the 1st and 2nd century continued throughout Europe, and synagogues in the 4th and 5th century were burnt and destroyed. And then we have the Crusades in the 11th century, where in the name of Jesus, Jews were killed en masse in Europe and in Israel, their homeland. And then we have the Reformation in the 16th century with Luther. And Luther actually instructed the followers in Christendom to burn synagogues and burn the books belonging to Jews, because they were a danger, he said, to Christianity. And then that instruction continued throughout those centuries, but actually came to a climax on the 9th of November in 1938, on an evening we now call Kristallnacht, which was a night of broken glass, when thousands of people came out on the streets in Berlin and in various other parts of Germany and Austria and smashed the houses and the synagogues, actually burnt the synagogues, and burnt books belonging to Jews in the center of their cities. And in fact, the hatred on the 9th of November in 1938 that was expressed by ordinary people was such that the following day there was a meeting which was attended by 100,000 people, giving credence to what had happened the night before. And in fact, churches and church leaders were part of that meeting. Not only have churches been part of the teaching of hatred, but governments as well. And when government and church came together in the 1930s to join forces in this vitriolic hatred towards the Jewish people, it was an ignition in the fuel of anti-Semitism, which flared up and caused the death of 6 million Jews. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the Jewish question was already being debated by the churches. And Hitler didn't, in fact, create the idea of elimination of Jews. It was a Protestant theologian called Gerhard Kittel on the 1st of June, 1933, who spoke in terms of elimination of the Jews of Europe. And he was applauded when he went through 4 ways of eliminating the Jews who were living in the communities in which the churches were based. And then in the same year, Priscilli, who was the cardinal for Berlin, signed an agreement on behalf of the Catholic Church with the Nazi Party that they would stand with the Nazi Party in their policies. And at that time, their policies were already the restriction and injustices towards the Jewish people. But at the same time, the Protestant communion joined with the Catholic communion in this teaching of hatred towards the Jewish people. So it's important, and in fact vital, that we remember what happened and that we actually stand with the Jewish people at this time so that it doesn't happen again, because already anti-Semitism is increasing today. In 2009, the United Kingdom had the worst record of anti-Semitism in Europe. That's an indictment on us today, and it's something that we really need to understand to try and fight this teaching of hatred that is continuing in our nation. So first of all, we want to begin by looking at some testimony from two survivors in Holocaust, which tell the story of children being the initial persecutors. And why we're going to look at that, that piece of film, is that when Hitler was a child, he was taught hatred towards the Jewish people. In 1880, we have the pogroms in Russia. We have the popes who were teaching that Jews should be eliminated from the communities of Rome. We have newspapers, both Christian and political, which were being published to say that Jews should be are a scourge and a danger to society. So Hitler's mother and father came back from the churches, read the newspapers, and that story was enforced, and they passed it on to Hitler and his friends in school. So they grew up with this teaching of hatred. And it's important that we speak about other people groups with love to our children, not with hatred, because the consequences are the Holocaust. And the beginnings of that persecution start with what these survivors tell is bullying and persecution in the schoolyard and in their community. So Tom, can we have a look at Sam, can you do the lights, please, for the film?
Became very popular, and all our former friends belonged to the Hitler Youth. And as time went by, they knew where the Jewish schools were, and they would wait for us to come out of school in the afternoon and beat us up. They would, what you call today, mug us. In other words, they would look for our pocket money and take it, and things of that sort. I remember, to give you an instance, this was later on, around 1937, 38, I was studying for my bar mitzvah, and I had to go to the home of our cantor that was going to teach me how to do what I had to do. And there were some kids, my age, not much older, who knew that a cantor lived there, because the cantor was very proud, and he had his name on a brass plate with the title cantor underneath. And these Hitler Youth children knew that Jewish boys would come there regularly, one every hour during the afternoon, and they were waiting for us. And they would beat us up. And if you denied that you were Jewish or tried to, they would go through your pockets. And if you were carrying a kippah or anything like that, they would really become quite cruel, as children can be, both physically and abuse and verbally. So it was a gradual thing which degenerated from just ignoring us to actually becoming physical and making life a little tough.
As the years went by, like in 1934, there was a terrible paper being published. It was called the Stürmerzeitung, Stormtrooper newspaper. Everything seemed to be stormtroopers, troopers. And that was a horrible paper. That affected me terribly because it was, it had all it was plastered on all these stores that sold newspapers. And in the morning, going to school, I would see these Stürmerzeitung and people standing and reading them. And what did they list in this Stürmerzeitung? They had people faces with long noses and saliva running from their mouth and looking at, of course, typically, you know, they meant Jewish people because they always wrote about Jewish people with their long noses. And they were looking at little Gentile children greedily looking at the money that the children had in their hands, like they wanted to steal the money from these children. And they had terrible stories in there that Jewish doctors trying to inject Gentiles with poisonous medication. They had bankers that would swindle Jews out of their money. And here I was walking to school, and people were actually reading this, and young people, old people, of all ages. And by the time I got to school, I couldn't learn.
Okay, Tom. So that's how it starts. And it shouldn't get to that stage anyway, but that's how it began in Germany. So what I'm going to do is ask you, Viv, if you can light the middle candle for us, please, as a representative of the Jewish community, but also those who've been persecuted in history because of the Gentile political parties and the church. Thank you, Viv. Thank you, Viv. Ask Keith just to tell us a story about a place called Ponary, which is a city in Lithuania. Sam, can you put the lights on, please? In Lithuania. And he'll tell you the story there. But Ponary is what is known as the killing fields. And Jill and Ed Walker will be telling us about the story about that as well. But between 1939 and 1941, over 2 million Jews were shot and murdered in their communities in countries such as Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, just because they were Jews. They were taken from within their communities by their neighbors and handed over to police units who, in the case of Lithuania, were not Germans, and they were shot. It's true to say that in Lithuania, the local people killed their Jewish neighbors before the German occupation took place. So the teaching of hatred had such an effect on the communities that police and neighbors of families took and shot innocent people. And this 2 million is to some extent forgotten in our history because we focus on the camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Birkenau, and those other camps. But there were many, many other places where Jews were killed en masse. In fact, the Washington Holocaust Museum has just finished a publication in which their researchers have proved that there were over 42,000 camps in German-occupied territory. Auschwitz alone had 50 satellite camps. So everybody knew about this. Everybody knew about the killings in the killing fields in the first 2 years of the war. Nobody could say that they didn't know because there were so many of these killings taking place. And then when we come to the camps, which we're going to hear a little bit about a bit later on, applies as well, because every community saw Jews who lived with them disappear. And in fact, some of them actually helped those Jews to disappear in the most tragic ways possible. So the first thing Keith and Jill are going to speak about are two places which are classed as the killing fields. And on the banner here, you'll see the story of the killing fields is there. But it's important for us to know that the memorials of these killing fields, many of them have been hidden, and their stories have not been told. So Keith and Jill and Ed will just update us with regard to the memorials of two places. So Keith, if you can speak first of all, thank you.
Ponary, Lithuania, was the murder site of the Jews of Vilna and the surrounding area. It was situated 10 kilometers south of Vilna on the road to Grodno. Before the war, it was a forested area used for holidays and recreation. Vilna residents used to go there for summer holidays and to gather berries and mushrooms. The site was chosen for murder due to its proximity to the train track, and also because there were pits, 12 to 23 meters wide and 5 to 8 meters deep. There were high embankments with ditches between the pits, which had been dug by the Soviets in 1940 as a planned emergency fuel store. From June 1941 until July 1944, over 75,000 people were murdered in Ponary, most of whom were Jewish. The others were Soviet prisoners of war and local opponents to the Nazi regime. The victims that were brought to the murder site on foot, by motor vehicles, by train, in groups of tens, hundreds and thousands. There they were shot and buried. During this period, a diary of events was recorded by Kamiras Shaksakovich, a journalist who lived directly opposite to the site of the murders. This is what he wrote for the events which took place on the 5th of April 1943. I see children, all in their underwear. Shots are fired. From the gate, a new group, perhaps 400 people, appears, quite closely surrounded. Apparently, the Lithuanians, learning from the escape of the first group, are guarding the second one carefully. All lie down in front of the pit with their faces to the ground. They count off several dozen people and lead them to the pit. They are saying something. At least one of the Lithuanians says something to the condemned, who begin to undress. A woman with a child in her arms and with two small girls hanging onto her dress, a Lithuanian begins to beat them mercilessly with a club. A Jew without a jacket throws himself on the Lithuanian to defend the woman being beaten. A shot is fired. He falls practically at the feet of his Jewess. A second Lithuanian seizes the Jewish woman's child and throws him into the pit. The Jewish woman, like a mad woman, runs to the pit, followed by her two little girls. 3 shots are fired. Oh, horror. That group, women, men, and children, are all stripped naked. By themselves, they obediently run to the pit. Shots are fired. I visited Ponary with Mike 2 years ago, and here's just a brief summary of some observations. What sticks out in my mind, firstly, is the gangplank or ladder that is still in the pit where people would walk along. They would walk down this ladder when the pit was empty, but as the pit would fill up with bodies, dead bodies, it would rise. These pits had the bodies dug up and burned. they were dug up and then reburied elsewhere to cover up the crimes. There's lots of monuments in the forest and lots of memories. There's lots of things there that commemorate the deaths of all these people. But the most poignant for me was the little stones that were laying in clusters on the ground with names on and dates, all commemorating people's lives and families. But what struck me, one of the most incredible things, was the way the air hung somehow. The term deathly silence became a reality to me because there was something deathly about that place. It was a silence that was so strange. There was something wrong, very much.
Good evening. My husband and I would like to share some thoughts about the Jewish massacre at Babi Yar in 1941. From the 29th to the 30th September in 1941, the planned, systematic, and very well recorded massacre of 33,771 Jewish people took place at Babi Yar. And Babi Yar is an enormous ravine on the outskirts of Kiev in the Ukraine. In a seemingly endless procession, an almost silent procession, these Jewish families walked with their possessions in line without a protest. They walked the 2.5 kilometers to Babi Yar. Here, the Einsatzgruppe and mobile squads, helped in this monstrous task by so many of the local Ukrainian people, the militiamen. Anyone was quite happy to help. They machine-gunned every last one into this ravine at Babi Yar. And it symbolizes, Babi Yar symbolizes the horrific and absolutely systematic mass murder of European Jewry, memorializing the persistent failure, utter failure, ignorant silence of the world to even acknowledge that this utter tragedy was being permitted to happen. There was silence. And it's estimated that some 100,000 people were actually murdered at Babi Yar around about this time, including Roma, communists, and also Soviet prisoners of war. On a couple of visits to the area the dead and I have made, we have stood beside this seemingly endless grave pit of Babi Yar, now so nicely grass-covered. And yet we know precisely, because of our imaginations, what is beneath the grass. And we try somehow to make some kind of meaningful thoughts about such overwhelming massacres of human souls, especially for we who care so much for the Jewish people. Somehow it made it worse. And we were utterly and totally shocked that there was no actual Jewish memorial placed at Babi Yar itself, only a massive, seemingly unrelated and powerful Russian granite statue complete with, guess what? Crosses. Only much later, was a memorial, a menorah, in fact, statue permitted. But that wasn't even at Babi Yar. We had to go and search in the forest to find it. A small little memorial. These men and women and families simply walked to Babi Yar in total obedience, having been repeatedly informed to be silent by large notices along the route in both Russian and Ukrainian, not Hebrew, you note. And the signs read, so ironically, failure to do so, to walk in silence, failure to do so will be punished by death. The message being, whether you resist or obey, you die anyway. Yevgeny Yevtushenko, a radical Russian poet, author and a dramatist from Siberia, who actually only died last April, wrote a poem about the lack of a memorial at Babi Yar, about the Nazi atrocities, and also about Soviet persecution of Jewish people. In fact, Dmitri Shostakovich also wrote a symphony based on this very poem, the essence of this poem, which Ed is going to read.
No monument stands over Babi Yar. A drop, sheer as a crude gravestone. I am afraid. Today, I am as old in years as all the Jewish people. Now, I seem to be a Jew. Here I plod through ancient Egypt. Here I perish, crucified on the cross. And to this day, I bear the scars of nails. I seem to be Dreyfus. The Philistine is both informer and judge. I am behind bars, beset on every side, hounded, spat on, slandered.
Thank you, Ed and Jill. We're just going to take a minute now to listen to just 1 minute of this 13th symphony by Dmitri Shostakovich. So we'll just listen to that for a moment. The next important factor about Holocaust is the ghettos. And we have a pull up here which speaks about the ghettos, the ghettoization of the Jews, gathering them together and restricting their access to human rights of any sorts, to tying them in, fencing them in, persecuting them. And inside the ghettos, Jews struggled to connect with the outside world. But still, many of them thought about the outside world. And they wrote poetry, there was art, they created beautiful art, they created music in the ghettos. So I'm going to ask Becky if she'll come and read one of the poems by an unknown poet from the Warsaw Ghetto. So Becky, can you come and read? Have you got it?
Transport. Impossible to escape this sealed place. We stand to sleep. No food, no space. People lose sanity, suffocate, delirious, betray names, dates. Prophecy our fate with eldritch prayers. Lament our unsung dead, rave, swear. Even those who endured untold torture cannot withstand this last nightmare. Trucks rattle, bodies sway. This rhythmic clack spelt holiday. Parents, picnic box. Soon all that we possess will be stripped from us. We'll stand in nakedness beneath the gas. They'll stuff our hair in mattresses, put us to use as lampshades, handbags, soap, recycle us.
So the next aspect of Holocaust were the death camps, when the ghettos were cleansed, if that's the term that is used, of the Jewish communities there. They were taken from there to the death camps. And at the death camps, they were murdered in the most brutal way. And we've got a Holocaust survivor testimony, numerous testimony of what happened in the camps, but we've got testimony for you to listen to now. And it's a 3-minute testimony of a survivor. So, Tom, are you okay?
When we arrived to Auschwitz, the minute they opened the wagons, it was just total, complete misery, beatings and screamings and beatings and barking of dogs and growling of dogs and whistles of trains and screaming and beating and screaming and commands given. It was just like you open the doors and all of a sudden you find yourself in this inferno, in this unimaginable horror that you, as an adult or a child, would see in nightmares, and it was just coming through. And we were just holding on to each other, and I don't know, within minutes, my mother and my sister were dragged to one side, and I was dragged with my dad to another. We were told to go to another side. And they never had a chance to say goodbye to my mother, never had a chance to say goodbye to my sister. The pace, the speed of this thing, it was done by design. It was done to both for the person not to be able to comprehend or understand or in any way be able to think for a second what was happening. It was just incredible. It was just an incredible situation. And it was just, as I tell it to you now, it's difficult for me to even describe it, because it was happening on a minute-to-minute situation. And I got into this line. It was this big line, and I saw my mother on the other side. There was another side where the women went, and I never saw her cry. I never saw her reach out. She just, the last time I saw her, she was hanging on to my sister. And my dad hollered to her, you take care of her, I'll take care of him, in Yiddish. And whatever we have to do, this was the last word I heard. And my dad threw me in front of him. And he says, keep walking very tall, don't even, because we were observing what was going on in the front, in the front of the lines. And the one thing you didn't want is for the Germans to see that you were holding on to your child, because that was the whole idea, is to break up the family, murder the family. That was the genocide of the whole thing. So by not identifying that this is your child, there was a little bit of an edge you had to possibly survive. The fact that you were on your own and you sort of didn't belong to any family.
Viv, I know this is very difficult for you, but could you just say a prayer for those who died?
The memorial prayer for the victims of the Holocaust. God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant perfect rest beneath the shadow of your divine presence in the exalted places among the holy and pure, who shine as the brightness of the skies. To our 6 million brethren, men, women and children, who were murdered, slaughtered, burned alive, gassed, drowned or buried alive by the Nazis and their collaborators, and who died in the sanctification of God's name. And now pray for the precious souls. May the Lord of compassion shelter them in the shadow of his wings for all eternity. Binding up their souls in the bond of eternal life. The Lord is their inheritance. May they rest in peace. And let us say, Amen.
Thank you, Viv. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Thank you. What I'd like to do now is I'd like us to just reflect on the events that we've heard about and on the prayer that Viv has kindly prayed for us on our behalf. And to do that, I'd like us to listen to the music called Benedictus, played by the two cellos. So we'll just have, it's a 7-minute symphony. But if we can just take that time to think about what we've heard, and then we'll move on to the next section. Thank you. It's a very moving piece of music, isn't it? But I think it's important that we remember and think deeply about what we hear and the stories that we've been told tonight. And the next part of our presentation is to remember those who were not Jewish, but who died as a result of the Nazi agenda for an Aryan race. And I want to introduce Karen Jones, a friend, but also a very, very passionate teacher from Ysgol Maes Hyfryd in Flint, a special needs school. And Karen has worked with special needs children for 20-some odd years. She likes to think she's 23, but she's not. She's a little bit older than that. But Karen is going to tell us a story of one of those who died and a Nazi policy which encountered other groups of people who were murdered in Holocaust. So thank you, Karen.
Like Mike said, I'm a teacher in Ysgol Maes Hyfryd, which is a special needs school in Flint. It's made up of several different types of needs of pupils. A lot of them you can tell by their physical appearance that they have special needs. A lot of them you can't. And it just goes to show the different types of needs that there are. I actually was very fortunate that Michael invited myself to bring my pupils along to have a look at the exhibition on Monday. And they were very touched, they were very moved by what they actually saw. And when we got back the following day, I did a bit more of in-depth work on it with them. And some of the words that they came up with after seeing the display and after we talked about it were depressing, torture, cruel, heartless, nasty, terrifying, gloomy, unhappiness, unwashed, graves, dirty, skinny bodies. This is an account from Manfred Bernhardt. Manfred was born in 1929 to a German family in Dortmund and grew up with his loving parents and sister, Gerda. He was born with epilepsy and water on the brain, and he was a loving child. In 1942, his family reluctantly sent him to a children's care home in Applerbeck in the belief that he would receive better care than they could give him in that wartime. His parents were unaware that Applerbeck was part of a secret euthanasia program in which doctors and nurses killed the patients in their care. 6 months after Manfred's arrival at Applerbeck, he was murdered by his doctors as they considered him unworthy of life. Manfred was one of 70,000 Germans who were murdered by Nazi doctors because they were disabled in some way. Manfred was a victim of the euthanasia known as the T4 program, which was Nazi Germany's first program of mass murder. The program was one of many radical eugenic measures, which was, as the Nazis called it, an effort to restore the racial integrity of the German nation. It aimed to eliminate what the supporters considered life unworthy of life, i.e., those individuals whom they believed, because of severe psychiatric, neurological, or physical disabilities, represented both a genetic and financial burden on German society and state. Beginning in October 1939, public health authorities began to encourage parents of children with disabilities to admit their young children to one of a number of specially designed paediatric clinics throughout Germany and Austria. In reality, the clinics were children's killing wards. There, specially recruited medical staff murdered their young charges by lethal doses of medication or starvation. The most notorious of these institutions in Austria was Amtsspielgrund, where from 1940 to 1945, 78,900 children were killed by lethal injection, gas poisoning, and physical abuse. This programme was also extended as the war progressed to adults and children in other occupied countries.
Thank you, Karen. And I think it's particularly pertinent that you, as a special needs teacher, were able to read that out to us, and it's really touching and impacting. So thank you very much. But now we move on to something which speaks more of hope, because we're going to move on and hear stories, 3 stories of rescuers. Although their stories are sad in themselves, there were many people in Holocaust who rescued. And today, because they rescued Jews and because the regime throughout Europe didn't succeed in killing the European Jewry, and Jews went back to their homeland Israel, because of that, there is hope. And the exhibition that we have on the walls here is an exhibition of children who live in Sderot, near to the war zone in Gaza. And it's an expression of hope. And these stories of these survivors is part of that. But I want to make a presentation tonight. And Richard, if I could ask you to come out, please. Because there are many people today who are students of Holocaust, like Richard Arthur here, who actually struggle to deal with the questions that Holocaust brings up. And Richard is really well read about Holocaust. And I know that tonight will have impacted him and saddened him. But I just want to tell you, Richard, there is hope. There is hope. And the children that we see are the great-grandchildren of the survivors of Holocaust. So there is hope. And I want to just present you with a picture of the little boy that you pray for regularly here, just to say thank you for people like yourselves who have a real passion to remember Holocaust and remember the children who are the result of the survivors. So thank you, Richard. Let's give him a round of applause. So thank you. Yes, you should.
When we first saw this exhibition, we prayed about various of the people staying. Both Mark and I have been to Sderot and we've been to Kafaraza, where a lot of these photographs were taken. And this particular one impacted me because I prayed about it, and the Lord said to me, some of you will know this, the Lord said to me that he will become a nation builder. And we just pray about that, but this little boy, Grace didn't know his name. He was just a lad playing in the yard, and he's a nation builder. The Lord has said that.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now, as we move on to the rescuers, we've got a story here of an ordinary man who became an amazing rescuer in Holocaust. A man of courage, and I'm introducing Keith Fairclough to read Leopold Socker's story, because Keith is just an ordinary guy. He's a taxi driver in Liverpool, but he's passionate about social justice and passionate about Holocaust and the children who survived the Holocaust. So if you'll read the story, Keith, of Leopold Socker. Thank you.
The German invasion of Poland took place on Friday, September the 1st, 1939. The occupiers were brutal, and between 1939 and 1945, at least 1.5 million Polish citizens were deported. 1.9 million non-Jewish Polish civilians and 3 million Polish Jews were murdered. The Polish army was defeated after more than a month of fierce fighting. The Jews of Poland were hunted down and persecuted. Anyone caught helping Jews were immediately shot along with their families. Leopold Szosza was a sewer worker in the town of Lwów in Poland. In the summer of 1943, the Nazis liquidated the remaining Jews in the Lwów ghetto. Before the liquidation, a Jew by the name of Ignacy Chignar dug a tunnel from his room in the ghetto and smuggled his family into the sewers. Leopold, his wife and co-worker, found them, and even though they were aware that if they were caught open Jews, they would be executed, they decided to try and protect them. They helped to feed and clothe 21 Jews in the sewers over a 14-month period. 10 of these Jews survived the war, and Leopold led them out of the sewers when Poland was liberated. Leopold died on the 12th of May, 1946.
Thank you, Keith. Keith, would you like to? We seem to assume that the rescuers in Holocaust were maybe Gentiles who were not part of the Nazi party, not part of the regime, but actually there were even Nazis who tried to help Jews. And I want to introduce you to Ed Nicholas, who is going to read a story about one particular and very important Nazi officer who did his best to tell the story about what was happening during the war. So Ed, I look forward to the story. Thank you.
Kurt Gerstein joined the Waffen-SS in 1942 to find out if the rumors about the murders of patients with physical and mental problems were true. In the summer of 1942, he visited the Nazi death camps at Sobibor, Bujets, and Treblinka, and witnessed the murder of thousands of Jews. On the 17th of August 1942, whilst in Bujets, he witnessed the gassing of 3,000 Jews. His report reads as follows. Then the procession starts moving. In front, a very lovely young girl. So all of them go along the alley, all naked, men, women, children, without artificial limbs. I myself stand on top of the ramp between the gas chambers. Mothers with babies at their breast. They come onward, hesitate, enter the death chambers. After the doors are closed, there is a technical hitch. The diesel motor will not start, but finally, after 2 hours and 49 minutes, the stopwatch has registered. Everything well. The diesel starts. Until this moment, the people live in these 4 chambers, 4 times 750 people in 4 times 45 cubic meters. Again, 25 minutes pass. Many are dead now. One can see that through the small window in which the electric light illuminates the chambers for a moment. After 28 minutes, only a few are still alive. And finally, after 32 minutes, everyone is dead. Now, Kurt managed to get this detailed information to the Swedish government, but they kept it secret because they didn't want to anger Nazi Germany. He then managed to get the Dutch resistance to broadcast the information to the British government via radio. Even though the British Foreign Office were aware of the murders, they dismissed the reports as exaggerated and untrue. The British government did not react to this information, and so the murder of millions of Jews continued. And finally, Kurt reported all the facts to both the Roman Catholic and Protestant churches in Berlin, but they failed to speak out against the killings. In despair that no one would listen, Kurt committed suicide on the 25th of July, 1945.
Nobody listened, but he did speak out. He did do all he could, and that's what we need to do. In Holocaust, there are 4 categories of people, and in every genocide, it's the same. There are the victims. You can't choose not to be a victim. You are a victim. You're in that category, and in Holocaust, if you were Jewish, you were definitely in that category. If you had... if you were opposed the Nazi regime, you were in that category of victim. And as we heard from Karen, if you were physically or mentally challenged, you were in that category. But then we have the persecutors. You can choose whether you're a persecutor or not. In fact, the evidence from the killing fields with the reports that we have from the police battalion show us very clearly that if you didn't want to volunteer, and they were volunteers, if you didn't want to volunteer to shoot, then you could say, I can't do this. And in one particular case, in Battalion 101, 12 officers from that battalion of 450 who were policemen before the war, can you believe that? 12 said they didn't want to shoot. And they weren't punished or persecuted. In fact, some of those were promoted. So it's a fallacy to say that you had to kill. You didn't. So you had a choice whether you were a persecutor or not. And then there is the bystander. There are those people who did nothing at all. They watched as their neighbors were taken away, as the trains passed through their towns, as the gunshots were heard in the night and sometimes in the day behind the police stations, and they chose to do nothing. They didn't speak out. Let's not forget that 95% of Germany was Christian during the war. If the church had stood up and done something, the Holocaust would not have happened. If every man had been like Leopold Socker and Gerd Kirstein, the Holocaust couldn't have taken place. And then we have this final group, the rescuers. And I think that's the group that everybody wants to be in. We all want to be rescuers, don't we? We all want to fight for the social justice for our fellow man. But how many of us are prepared to die for it? The people we hear about were prepared to die. And I'm delighted to have Lynn Payne with us, head of history in Mold Allen High School in Mold, who actually teaches her children Holocaust, because Lynn is going to tell us about one of those rescuers who actually was prepared to die to rescue her fellow man. So Lynn, can I invite you to come and share? Thank you. And will you light a candle for the rescuers after? Thank you.
1921 in Budapest, Hungary, to Jewish parents. She was a daughter of an author and a journalist. She demonstrated her own literary talent from an early age, and she kept a diary from age 13 until shortly before her death. As a result of extreme anti-Semitism, she managed to leave Budapest in 1939 to go and live in Israel, where she studied at an agricultural school and continued to write poetry. In 1943, after hearing about the deportations of Jews to the murder camps, Hannah joined the British Army and volunteered to be parachuted into Europe. The purpose of this operation was to help the Allied efforts in Europe and establish contact with partisan resistance fighters in an attempt to aid beleaguered Jewish communities. Hannah trained in Egypt and was one of 33 people chosen to parachute behind enemy lines. With the goal of reaching her native Budapest, Hannah parachuted into Yugoslavia in March 1944. On the 7th of June 1944, at the height of the deportation of the Hungarian Jews to the death camps, Hannah crossed the border into Hungary. She was caught almost immediately by the Hungarian police and tortured cruelly and repeatedly over the next several months. Despite these conditions, Hannah refused to divulge any information about her mission. Even the knowledge that her mother was at risk and that she too might be harmed did not compel Hannah to cooperate with the police. At her trial in October 1944, Hannah staunchly defended her activities and refused to request clemency. Throughout her ordeal, Hannah remained steadfast in her courage, and when she was executed by a firing squad on November the 7th, 1944, she refused the blindfold, staring squarely at her executors and her fate. Hannah was only 23 years old when she was executed. The following poem was found in Hannah's death cell after her execution. 1, 2, 3, 8 feet long, 2 strides across, the rest is dark. Life is a fleeting question mark. 1, 2, 3, maybe another week, or the next month may still find me here, but death, I feel, is very near. I could have been 23 next July. I gambled on what mattered most. The dice were cast. I lost. Her diary and literary works were later published, and many of her more popular poems have been set to music. The best of these is Towards Sisera. My God, may it never end. The sea and the sand, the splash of the water, the brilliance of the sky, the prayer of man.
Thank you, Lynn. An amazing woman. And we mustn't forget that over 3,000 Jews joined the British Army. Jews from Austria and Germany to go back into Austria and Germany to act as undercover agents to fight on our behalf in the war. They did an amazing job, and Hannah was an amazing woman. And she didn't have to go back into Europe to fight, but she did it for her fellow man. What a wonderful woman. And as we draw to a close now, and we've got a couple of things to do before we do close, I want us to listen to a piece of music and remember the rescuers, and maybe think about whether we would be a bystander today when other people groups are being persecuted, or whether we would be a rescuer. So if we can listen to this piece of music, it's played by Hauser. It's Albione's Adagio, and it's 6 minutes long. So let's just remember the rescuers, but also think about how we play our role in our society today. The picture on the screen is of a mother and child in a killing fields in Minsk, just outside Minsk in Belarus. And the picture was given to me by a historian, a Jewish historian who lives in Minsk. And he's a writer on Holocaust. And today his books can't be published because of the government in Belarus, which won't allow him to tell the story of the Holocaust in Belarus, which clearly happened and is forgotten. So he sent me the photograph, and Grace, my daughter, is a photographer, has just colored the hair of the little girl to show us that this is the life of a mother and child who were innocent victims of hate by a nation that didn't need to commit any crime whatsoever. I want to just finish by saying one thing, and then I'm going to ask Shirley and Helen to sing, or lead us in the hymn, The Lord's My Shepherd. But I want to say one thing that gives us hope. I'm a man of faith, and I read the Bible, and I believe what is said in the Bible. I believe everything that is said, and I like one of the prophets, particularly a man called Ezekiel, who is a brave man. And he's given a message by God, which many of you will know, I don't know whether you know, is a message that we know as the Valley of Dry Bones. But actually, that message should be called the resurrection of Israel, because we hear the story that Ezekiel, he says in verse 1, he says, "And the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he lifted me up, and he took me out by his Spirit into a valley. And the valley was full of bones." And then in the last verses of Ezekiel 37, we hear the story that God tells Ezekiel to tell and speak to the bones, to say, "I will put sinews upon you. I will cover you in flesh, and I will cover you in skin, and I will breathe my Spirit into you, and you will come out of your graves, and you will return to the land of Israel." Now that is a resurrection of those who were killed and murdered in Europe at the hands of not only Germany, but European authorities right throughout Europe, including the church. And God is faithful. He says, "I'm faithful to all my promises." And he says, "I will never leave you or forsake you." And one of the questions in Holocaust studies is always, at the end of the study, where was God in Holocaust? Because everybody wants to blame God. But actually, where was humanity? That should be the question. Because we, our fathers, are to blame. God is faithful. And the story that he gave Ezekiel gives hope to the Jewish people that he hasn't forgotten them. And there will come a time when he will resurrect them. Those from Belsen who are in unmarked graves, mass graves. Those that Jill spoke about in Babi Yar, that Keith spoke about in Ponery. The rescuers that died. God hasn't forgotten. He hasn't forgotten about those people. So when we think of a valley in Scripture, it's the nations. Not Israel, it's the nations. So we're going to sing now, Shirley and Helen, "The Lord's My Shepherd." And then I'm going to hand the meeting back to Becky, who will finish the meeting. So let's stand and sing this hymn.
My shepherd, I'll not want. He makes guides my ways in righteousness, and he anoints my head with oil, and my cup it overflows with joy. I feast on his pure delights, and I will trust in you, and I will trust in you, for your endless mercy follows me. Your goodness will lead me home. And though I walk the darkest paths, I will not fear the evil one, for you are with me, and your rod and staff are the comfort I need to know. And I will trust in you, and I will trust in you, for your endless mercy follows me. Your goodness will lead me home, and I will trust in you, and I will trust in you, for your endless mercy follows me. Your goodness will lead me home. Your goodness will lead me home.
Thank you. Well, I hope this evening has been very special for you all, and we would like to invite you to have a look at the exhibition, and if you'd like to share in some refreshments next door with us, and we have some questionnaires for you to fill out. But thank you so much for joining us this evening. God bless.